Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Mysterious Murmurs. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 3: Night Shift. Rachel had worked the night shift at the 24-hour convenience store for months. The routine was simple: stock the shelves, clean the aisles, restock the cooler, and wait for the occasional late-night customer to wander in. Most nights, the store was eerily quiet, save for the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the soft beep of the cash register. But tonight felt different. It was well past midnight when Rachel noticed the first strange occurrence. She had just finished stocking the candy aisle when she heard a faint tapping sound coming from the back of the store near the employee break room. It was rhythmic, almost like someone tapping a pen against a table. She paused, listening, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it began. She shook it off, figuring it was just the building settling, and continued with her task. But as the minutes ticked by, the unease began to grow. The store felt colder than usual, a chill that crept under her skin. It wasn't the kind of cold that comes from air conditioning. It was something darker, like the air itself was watching her. Rachel tried to shake the feeling, but then she heard it again, louder this time. The tapping, but now there was something else. A low grating sound like nails dragging across concrete. She quickly glanced toward the back of the store, her heart racing. No one was there. She took a deep breath and moved to the cooler to restock some drinks. As she opened the door to grab a crate of sodas, she noticed something odd. The shelves in the cooler were all out of order. The drinks were scattered, some tipped over, others stacked haphazardly. She hadn't restocked the cooler recently, so she couldn't explain how they had gotten that way. Her pulse quickened. Rachel grabbed the crate, trying to ignore the gnawing sense of dread in the pit of her stomach. As she started to restock the shelves, a loud crash echoed from the back room. The sound of something heavy hitting the floor. "Hello?" Rachel called, her voice trembling. Silence. She walked cautiously toward the back of the store, her footsteps muted on the linoleum floor. The lights above flickered for a moment, casting brief shadows that danced along the walls. When she reached the break room, she stopped dead in her tracks. The door to the storage closet was ajar, and inside, the shelves were in disarray. Items scattered across the floor, as if someone had ransacked the room. But no one was there. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she heard another noise, a soft, breathy whisper. "Help me." It was faint, barely audible, but it was unmistakable. The sound came from somewhere deep within the store. Her mind raced, and her instincts screamed for her to leave, but her feet were frozen. The voice, it sounded almost familiar. The whisper came again, this time louder, as if it was right behind her. "Help me." Rachel spun around, but the room was empty. There was nothing but the flickering lights and the faint hum of the air conditioning. Then her phone buzzed. It was a text message from the store's number, the one that sent all the automated messages. "You're not alone." Before she could process it, the lights above her flickered again, this time plunging the store into darkness. She heard movement, footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving closer. Her phone screen flickered to life once more, showing a new message. "Look behind you." Rachel's blood ran cold. She didn't want to look, but the sound of those footsteps, getting closer, drove her to turn. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest and her mind screamed at her to run, but her body refused to move. The figure's eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. And then, in an instant, the lights flickered back on, and the figure was gone. Rachel was alone in the store again, but as she turned back to the counter, she saw a single word written on the register in what looked like smeared blood. Leave. Suddenly, the air felt thick, oppressive, suffocating. She reached for the phone to call for help, but as her fingers hovered over the screen, it buzzed once more. It's already too late. Rachel's hands trembled as she stared at the phone screen. Her breath was shallow, her pulse racing. She quickly dropped the phone onto the counter, her mind spinning. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get out of the store, but her feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The store had grown unnaturally quiet, save for the faint hum of the lights above. The cold that had settled in the air was becoming unbearable, a presence that clung to her skin. She stepped back, cautiously, her eyes scanning the aisles, searching for any sign of movement. The figure was gone, but the feeling that something was watching her lingered like a dark cloud. Suddenly, the register beeped. A customer? No one was supposed to be here at this hour. Rachel's heart skipped a beat as she turned toward the counter. The screen flashed, and then another message appeared. You're next. Her blood ran cold. She reached for the phone again, desperate to call for help. But as she lifted it to her ear, the line was already open. The same low, distorted voice filled the air, hissing, almost garbled. Don't try to leave. You belong here. Rachel slammed the phone down in a panic, her eyes darting around the store. That was when she noticed something even more chilling. The door, the one she had locked earlier, was wide open. The wind outside howled, sending a chill through the air. She hadn't heard the door open. Had someone been here? Had the figure? Before she could process it, a strange scratching noise echoed from the back of the store. Slowly, almost instinctively, Rachel began to move toward it, her heart pounding in her chest. The noise was coming from the storage closet, the same one she'd seen earlier in disarray. She hesitated, but something about the sound, like nails scraping against wood, drove her forward. As she approached the door, it creaked open by itself. The darkness inside felt suffocating, thick and oppressive. With a shaky breath, Rachel stepped inside. The closet was empty, except for one thing. In the corner, on the floor, was a small old mirror. Its surface was covered in smudges, like fingerprints pressed into the glass. Hesitantly, she picked it up, feeling an unnatural weight in her hand. She wiped the dust away, revealing the reflection. Her own face stared back at her, but it wasn't right. The reflection of Rachel was smiling, grinning, widely, but she hadn't moved her lips. The smile stretched unnaturally, too wide, too sharp. The eyes in the mirror were dark, hollow, as if they weren't even hers. Frozen in place, Rachel's breath hitched and she stumbled back, dropping the mirror. It shattered on the floor with a sharp crack, sending a jolt of panic through her. But before she could react, a loud bang echoed from the front of the store. She ran out of the closet, her mind racing. Her eyes darted toward the door, only to find it slammed shut, the exit sign glowing ominously above it. She pressed her hands against the door, desperate to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. Suddenly, the lights flickered once more, flickered and then died. The store plunged into complete darkness. She fumbled for her phone, the dim screen casting a weak glow as she struggled to find the flashlight function. But the phone screen went black before she could turn it on. In the silence that followed, Rachel heard it again, the sound of footsteps. But these footsteps weren't alone. There was something else, something dragging along the floor, scraping against the tiles. Rachel's breathing grew shallow as the sound grew closer, too close. The footsteps stopped, and a voice, distorted and hollow, whispered in her ear. "Time's up." Her heart pounded as the cold, clammy fingers of terror gripped her chest. Her only chance was to get out of the store, but the darkness, the unseen force pressing down on her, was she already too late? With everything she had left, she pushed against the door, using all her strength. But it wouldn't open. Not until a scream filled the air. It wasn't Rachel's. It wasn't human. It was a guttural, inhuman sound, filled with agony, echoing through the empty store. Rachel froze, her breath caught in her throat. She slowly turned around. The sound was coming from the back room, where the figure had stood. The shadow moved. It wasn't just standing anymore. It was coming toward her, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if it was struggling to maintain form. Its face, no longer hidden, was a twisted, distorted version of her own. Rachel took one last desperate step backward, her body screaming for escape. But the darkness consumed her. The lights flickered out for the final time. The store was silent again. Story 1, The Forgotten Ones. It started with an innocent discovery. Emma Clark, a freelance photographer, was always drawn to forgotten places. She spent her weekends exploring crumbling buildings, overgrown train stations, and decayed mansions, capturing their haunting beauty through her lens. One chilly autumn afternoon, while driving through a remote countryside, she noticed a rusted iron gate partially hidden by vines. Beyond it, a winding path led to a decrepit building. The sign above the gate, barely legible, read, "Willowbrook Home for Children." Emma's curiosity ignited. She grabbed her camera and pushed the gate open. The orphanage. The building was eerily silent, its windows shattered and its facade weathered by time. Ivy crawled up its stone walls, and the front door hung on broken hinges. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and mildew. The faint sound of creaking echoed through the halls, though there was no breeze. Emma wandered through the orphanage, her camera clicking as she captured the decaying remnants of what had once been a lively place. Tiny beds lined one room, their metal frames rusted. In another, she found old toys scattered on the floor. Wooden blocks, a ragged teddy bear, a doll with one eye missing. But it was the playroom that stopped her cold. Handprints, small, dusty, and impossibly fresh, covered the walls. They seemed to form patterns, as if the children had been playing some sort of game. Emma reached out to touch one, but a sharp whisper stopped her. "Don't." She spun around, but no one was there. The whispering begins. As she moved deeper into the orphanage, the whispers followed her. They were faint at first, like a breeze rustling leaves. "Help us, don't leave." Emma tried to convince herself it was her imagination. She focused on her photography, but the unease grew. Her camera began to malfunction, capturing strange anomalies in the photos. Blurred faces where there should have been none, and shadowy figures in the corners of rooms. The journal. In the headmaster's office, Emma found a leather-bound journal buried beneath a pile of rubble. Its pages were brittle, the ink faded but legible. The entries were disturbing. "The children are growing restless. They cry at night, saying they see shadows in their rooms. Food is running low, and the townspeople refuse to help us. They say we've brought a curse upon ourselves. I hear them whispering to me now. Not the children. Something else. Something darker." The final entry sent a chill down Emma's spine. "I can't protect them anymore. They're coming for the children. Forgive me. The shadows. Emma's flashlight flickered as she read the journal. The air grew colder, and the whispers turned into faint giggles. She turned to leave the office, but the door slammed shut. A child's voice, soft and eerie, echoed behind her. "Why did you leave us?" Emma spun around. A figure stood in the corner, a young boy in tattered clothes, his eyes hollow and his skin pale. He pointed at her, his voice trembling with anger. "You forgot us." The boy dissolved into shadow, and the room plunged into darkness. The escape panic set in. Emma fled the office, but the orphanage seemed to shift around her. Hallways stretched longer than they should. Doors led to rooms she hadn't seen before. The whispers grew louder, now mingled with sobs and cries. In one hallway, she saw them, children, dozens of them, their translucent forms glowing faintly. They stared at her with accusing eyes. "You left us," they chanted in unison. "You forgot." Emma ran, her breath ragged, but the children followed, their voices echoing. "Stay with us. Stay forever." The forgotten room. Emma stumbled into a room she hadn't seen before. It was pristine, untouched by time. Toys were neatly arranged, and sunlight streamed through the unbroken windows. In the center of the room stood a cradle. Inside was a doll, its glass eyes staring blankly upward. As Emma approached, the whispers stopped. Silence fell, thick and suffocating. She reached for the doll, but the cradle began to rock on its own. A woman's voice, low and filled with sorrow, spoke behind her. "You shouldn't have come here." Emma turned to see a figure, an adult this time. A woman in a tattered black dress, her face obscured by shadows. "You can't leave," the woman said. "You're part of them now." Emma bolted for the exit. The children's cries grew deafening, their ghostly hands reaching out for her. She burst through the front door and ran down the path, not stopping until she reached her car. But as she fumbled with her keys, she froze. In the rearview mirror, she saw them. Dozens of shadowy children standing at the gate, their hollow eyes watching her. She started the car and sped away, but the whispers followed her, growing louder with every mile. That night, as she reviewed the photos she'd taken, she saw something that made her blood run cold. In every image, the children were there, staring back at her. The final photo was of her, taken from behind. Her screen fades to black as the whispers echo, "You'll never forget us." A text appears. "Would you go back to save them, or run forever?" Story 2 deep below. It was supposed to be just another routine construction project. The developers in the city of Arden had long planned to expand the downtown district, adding a series of new skyscrapers and underground facilities to accommodate the growing population. The crew of construction workers had spent weeks drilling into the earth, preparing for the foundation of a new parking structure. However, as the drill bit hit something unusually hard one afternoon, they knew something was wrong. At first, it was just a loud, echoing thud that vibrated through the ground. Then came the crack, a massive shift deep underground. The noise echoed through the site, making the workers freeze in place. They weren't sure if it was the sound of a collapsing wall or something else, but when the drill bit continued to spin uncontrollably, they knew they had uncovered something far worse than rock. The foreman, Alan, was the first to inspect. He ordered the drilling to stop and directed the workers to check the area. As they dug away the surface dirt and debris, they exposed a large metal door, rusted with age but still intact. Its design was intricate, as if it had been crafted for something more important than a simple cellar. They tried to open it, but it was sealed tight. In their eagerness, they brought in equipment to force it open, unaware that with each movement, they were disturbing a forgotten world far beneath their feet. When the door finally gave way, it revealed a vast underground cavern. The workers' flashlights flickered as they looked down into the dark abyss. The ceiling was high, and they could see what appeared to be ancient stone walls stretching out of sight. But it wasn't the architecture that caught their attention. It was the faint, unsettling scent of decay, mixed with the metallic stench of something long dead. "Get the cameras," Alan ordered, his voice hushed as he took the first step into the cavern. The team followed, unsure of what to expect. The air was damp and heavy as they walked deeper into the cavern, the faint clicking of their boots echoing unnervingly in the vast space. It was then that they saw it. The city. It sprawled before them, vast and eerily preserved. Towers of stone rose from the ground, covered in moss and vines, yet still standing tall and defiant against time. The streets were paved with worn cobblestones, and strange carvings adorned the walls. In the distance, flickering torches illuminated the corners of the cavern, their light revealing ancient statues and broken structures. But what truly chilled them to the bone was the undeniable sense of life lingering in the shadows. As they ventured further into the city, they began to see figures moving between the buildings. At first, they thought it was just a trick of the light, but then the figures began to draw closer, stepping into the beam of their flashlights. They were human, at least they once had been. Their eyes were wide and vacant, their skin ashen and stretched thin over their bones. Their movements were jerky, as if they had long since lost the ability to walk in a natural way. Their bodies seemed to be in a perpetual state of decay, yet they were still very much alive, or something close to it. One of the workers, Jake, whispered in horror, "What are they?" Alan didn't answer, his mind racing. What they were looking at couldn't possibly be humans anymore. The creatures that lurked in the shadows were twisted, their faces contorted in grotesque masks of what might have once been people. Their eyes, though vacant, held a flicker of recognition. They seemed to be watching, waiting for something. The group began to backtrack, but as they turned, they heard a sound, low and guttural. It came from deep within the cavern, from beyond the city's crumbling walls. It was a low growl, almost like a growl of hunger, and then the ground shook. The workers scrambled to escape as the entire underground city seemed to stir to life. More creatures emerged from the shadows, crawling and slithering, their forms more grotesque than the first. Some of them appeared to be more human, with more recognizable features, but the closer they got, the more distorted they became. Their mouths opened wide in unnatural ways, revealing rows of teeth that gleamed in the darkness. Alan knew they had made a mistake. They had disturbed something ancient and dangerous. The city had been hidden for a reason, and now it was awake. As the workers ran, they could hear the creatures behind them, their footsteps growing louder, more frantic. It wasn't just curiosity driving them now. It was hunger. They raced to the entrance they had come through, but it was too late. The ground above had collapsed, sealing off their escape. Alan's mind raced as he thought of any way to get out. But it was the creatures that would soon decide if they ever left the city. They were surrounded. In the chaos, one of the workers, Sarah, stumbled and was pulled into the dark. Her screams echoed, but they quickly stopped as if she had been swallowed whole. Alan, gasping for breath, turned to the others. "We can't stay here. We need to find another way out." But as they turned, they saw what they had missed earlier. The city wasn't just a decaying relic. It was a trap designed to lure the curious and the foolish into its depths. And the creatures were not the only inhabitants of this underground world. Something darker, older, and far more dangerous stirred below the surface. Alan and the remaining workers had only moments before the full force of the city's curse would be unleashed. The ground shook again, and in the distance, something massive stirred. A shadow rose from the heart of the underground city, a towering figure, impossibly tall, its eyes glowing a bright, unnatural red. The creatures around them grew silent, bowing to this figure as if it was their king. Alan's breath caught in his throat. It was no ordinary creature. It was something ancient, something that had once been human, but not anymore. The creature's mouth opened, and in a voice that shook the very ground beneath them, it spoke, "You should not have come here." The screen fades to black. A text appears on the screen. Will they escape the wrath of the forgotten city, or will they become part of its dark history? Story 4, The Haunting Hour. It began innocuously enough. A late-night radio show known as The Haunting Hour aired on a small, obscure station in a sleepy town. The program had no flashy promotions, no big-name hosts, and no real fanfare. It was a simple talk show, but it had one eerie quirk. The show's broadcast time was precisely 3:13 a.m. The odd time slot intrigued a small but devoted following, mostly insomniacs, night shift workers, and curious souls looking for something different. But what drew them in wasn't just the time, it was the chilling content. Every night at exactly 3:13 a.m., the host would come on the air, his voice smooth and calm, speaking in a low, almost hypnotic tone. He introduced himself simply as the Whisperer. His voice was oddly soothing, and many listeners found themselves entranced, unable to turn away. However, the allure of the Haunting Hour wasn't in its stories, but in the peculiar and terrifying predictions it made. Each night, the show would air a single segment, a name, a date, and an unsettling description of how the person would meet their death. At first, listeners dismissed it as an elaborate hoax or a strange coincidence. But as the weeks went by, something unsettling began to happen. The names he spoke on air were not just random. They were real people. And more disturbing still, the manner of death he described always came true, down to the smallest detail. The first prediction. It was on a rainy night in early March when the first death occurred. The Whisperer had introduced the show, and as the clock struck 3:13 a.m., his voice filled the air. "Tonight's first prediction," he began, his voice smooth and chilling, "is for a man named Richard Turner. He is 32 years old and lives on Maple Street. At exactly 5:24 a.m. tomorrow, he will slip on the wet pavement while heading to his car. His head will strike the ground with such force that he will never regain consciousness." At first, Richard Turner's name meant nothing to anyone. He was just another ordinary listener of the late-night program. But as the night passed, an ominous feeling took hold of those who heard the prediction. They listened intently, their hearts racing as they imagined the scene unfolding. The prediction was so specific, so vivid, that it felt like a curse. The following morning, news broke. Richard Turner, a 32-year-old insurance salesman, had been found dead outside his home. He had slipped on the wet pavement while rushing to his car, just as the Whisperer had described. The news reports confirmed the time of death, 5:24 a.m. The entire town was in shock, and that was only the beginning. The fear spreads as the days passed. The names continued to be read on the haunting hour. Some were strangers to the listeners, but others were people they knew, local friends, acquaintances, or even family members. With each new broadcast, the fear grew. The Whisperer's predictions were becoming impossible to ignore. Tonight, I bring you a prediction for a woman named Emily Harper. She's 27 years old and lives alone on Birch Lane. At 10:47 p.m., she will open the door to find someone standing in the rain. She will invite them in, thinking it's a neighbor, but it's not. The person will stab her just as she turns to lock the door. The next day, Emily Harper's death was reported, exactly as described. Her neighbor's testimony confirmed that Emily had let someone into her home, thinking it was a friend. There were no witnesses, but the police found a blood-soaked knife in the living room, exactly as the Whisperer had predicted. And then it started to happen to people who had never even heard the show. The predictions were becoming widespread, spreading fear like wildfire. People stayed up late, listening to the eerie broadcast, terrified of what might come next. The desperation grows. As the predictions continued, the listeners' fear began to turn into obsession. Every night, they tuned in at 3:13 a.m., waiting for the next name. Some began to take desperate measures to avoid their predicted fates. People locked themselves in their homes, refused to leave, and some even went so far as to destroy their radios, hoping that by cutting the connection, they could escape the curse. But it didn't work. A woman named Sarah Matthews had turned off her radio the night before she was supposed to die. She sealed her house with locks and deadbolts and hid herself in the closet, waiting for the night to pass. But when the clock struck 3:13 a.m., she heard a voice whispering through the cracks in the walls. The Whisperer's voice, as cold and clear as ever, whispered her name. Sarah Matthews, 39 years old. She lives on Oak Avenue. At 4:58 a.m., she will hear someone knocking on her door. She will open it to find a delivery man holding a box. When she reaches for it, the man will stab her in the chest and leave her bleeding on the doorstep. The next morning, Sarah Matthews was found dead on her doorstep, exactly as the prediction had described. The radio, still turned off, lay beside her body. The final prediction. The fear reached a fever pitch as more and more people fell victim to the show's predictions. Desperation had set in. Listeners tried everything to break the cycle, but every night the predictions came true. No one knew how the Whisperer knew their names, their lives, and the exact moment of their deaths. It seemed like an inescapable fate. One night, a desperate listener named Tom Turner, a journalist, decided to confront the Whisperer. He broadcasted a live message to the station, challenging the Whisperer to make a prediction for him, daring him to predict his death. He was going to expose the truth, no matter the cost. At exactly 3:13 a.m., the show began. The Whisperer's voice, as smooth as ever, filled Tom's speakers. "Tonight, I have a prediction for you, Tom Turner. You are 28 years old, and you live in the city. At 3:33 a.m., you will turn off your radio and try to flee. You will not make it far. The darkness is already upon you. It is time." Tom, he had been sitting in his apartment, waiting for the show to start. His hand hovered over the radio, but his mind raced with questions. How could he escape this? How could he defy the Whisperer? At 3:33 a.m., Tom grabbed his jacket, ready to flee into the night. But as soon as he stood up, the room went cold. The lights flickered, and the air became thick with a strange pressure. His heart pounded as he reached for the door, but it wouldn't open. The room seemed to close in on him. Then the voice of the whisperer echoed in his mind, louder than ever. You cannot escape. You never could. And that was the last thing Tom Turner heard before everything went black. The next morning, his body was found in his apartment, curled up on the floor, a terrified look frozen on his face. The clock had stopped at 3:33 a.m. As the news spread, people began to realize something even more terrifying. The Whisperer's predictions weren't just about death. They were a curse that bound everyone who listened, trapping them in an inescapable fate. And every prediction would come true. Every name would be read. Every death would unfold. And as for the Whisperer, no one knew who or what he really was. The broadcast played on. Will you be the next name on the list? Or will you listen to the haunting whisper and escape?
If you've enjoyed this journey into the unknown, don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have a tale of your own or a legend you'd like us to explore? Let us know. You might just hear it next. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Because here, the darkness is always waiting just for you.